Okay, so now we're going to take a look at being able to calculate a running total and also being able to use what are known as Sentinel values with our loops. So to start off with, we'll take a look at getting a total where we know the number of items that we are going to be adding together. So we can see two different ways to do this. One is to just immediately do the calculations with some known set of numbers. The other is if you want to ask the user to go ahead and add some numbers together for us. So to get a total, we're first going to declare a variable to hold this total. So we need somewhere to store it. And we're initially going to make it 0. So obviously, if you're trying to get a total, before you even started doing any of your counting with any of the items that you're looking at, your total would start at 0. This variable will serve as what is known as the accumulator. So another term that we could use to refer to this by is accumulator. We're then going to implement a loop to iterate over a sequence of numbers to get our total. In the case of user input, we'll go ahead and request another number from the user on each iteration of the loop. So in this particular example, or this piece of code that we have right here, we can see we've got our int total equals 0. That's going to be our accumulator. We're going to go ahead and get the total of 5 user input numbers. So we're doing an int. In this case, we're just going to call it I. You could also use the name count. So we're going to say int I is equal to 1 initially. Our test condition or test expression is going to be as long as I is less than or equal to 5. So we're going to be doing this 5 times. And we're going to be incrementing the value of I each time. So we're going to have that I++ for your update expression. And then in the body of this, we're going to go ahead and do system.out.print. Please enter a number. So this is the part where we're making the request to the user. So we've got that print statement to let them know what it is that we're asking for. And then on the next line, what we're going to go ahead and do is essentially handle 2 parts of this at once. We're going to both get the value from the user, so we have keyboard.nextInt, and we're going to take that value and add it to total using a combined assignment operator. So essentially, we're just going to add whatever number the user gives us immediately to total. And because of the fact that we're doing this in a for loop, we will repeat this process 5 times. And then once we're done with this, when we break out of this for loop and move on to the next part of our program, the very last line we have right here is another print statement where we're just going to print out what the total is. So what is the sum of those 5 numbers that we got from the user. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize this. Come over to NetBeans. We're going to go ahead and create a new project. So make a new Java application. And for this one, since this is primarily going to be working with being able to calculate one of these running totals, both in this context that we've seen and also in a moment taking advantage of Sentinel values, the project name that I'm going to go with is just total calculation. Go ahead and click finish. And we'll go ahead and remove the extra comments. And make some adjustments to the style of this application. And then right here inside of the main method, we can go ahead and put in our int total, which is going to be equal to 0. Additionally, since we are going to be getting some input from the user, we're going to bring in the scanner class in a moment. So we'll go ahead and import that for now. And we'll go ahead and create the variable after I've at least demonstrated this once without any user input. So first what we'll go ahead and take a look at, we're going to have our for loop, say int, we'll call it I equal to 1, as long as I is less than or equal to 5. We're going to go ahead and keep incrementing it, and then also adding that value to our total. So right here, what we can go ahead and do is, I'll go ahead and just use the value I, so this value that we have right here, the variable. So initially it's going to be 1, and then we'll increment it to 2, 3, 4, and 5. And I'm just going to keep adding each one of those values to my total. So I'm going to say total plus equals this value of I. And then right here at the very end of the program, we can go ahead and print that value out. So we'll go ahead and do that right here. So say the total is, and then use string concatenation and say total. So if we go ahead and run this, we're going to do 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5. And so the end result is going to be 15. So now let's take a moment to kind of backtrack on this so we can actually see step by step precisely what is happening here. So in addition to getting the total, after each one of these iterations of this for loop, so on each individual run of it, I want to go ahead and print out the total at that point in time. Okay, so what's going to happen now is it will give me the total based on whatever the current step happens to be. So the very first time I do this, total is currently 0 when we first run this program. When we come into here, we're going to go ahead and set I to 1. This condition will be true, so we can go ahead and execute these statements. So the very first time we do this, keep in mind this is something like total equals total plus I. And so right now, total is 0, and I is going to be 1. So we're going to add those together and put 1 into total. So the very first time we print this out, it's going to go ahead and print out the value 1. Then the next time we go through this, so we increment I, so this 1 is going to be incremented to 2. Again, we see 2 less than or equal to 5, that's still going to be true. So we'll come over here. At this point, the total holds the value 1 that we already calculated from the previous iteration. And now the I is going to have the value 2 inside of it. So when you add these together, do 1 plus 2, that'll give you 3. Then we'll go ahead and increment the value I again. So after we print this out, saying that the total is now 3. So we increment I was previously 2, we'll increment it to 3. Again, 3 less than or equal to 5, it's still going to be true. So then we'll come over here and we'll go ahead and add it together. So total was 3, we got that from the previous step. And now I was incremented to 3, so we're going to do 3 plus 3, which will give us 6. So now the total is going to be 6. We'll then come over here and increment I again, so that goes to 4. 4 is less than or equal to 5. We do this line right here. So we're going to take the 6 that we just got from the previous iteration, add that to the 4 from this most recent iteration, or incrementation. So do 6 plus 4, that's going to give you 10. So then the total is 10. And then for the last successful run of this for loop, we'll increment I again to 5. So we say 5 less than or equal to 5 is still true. So then we're going to take the 10 that we currently have, add 5 to that, and then print that out right here. So that last print statement is going to print out the value 15. And then when we increment I again, it'll go up to 6, which is going to make this false. So we're not going to execute any of this anymore. And since we are going to get 15 on that last print statement, I technically won't need this since it just prints out the exact same thing. So now we'll go ahead and take a look at this with the print statement inside of the for loop so we can see each one of the individual runs of the loop. So we're going to run this again, and now we can see the total is 1 for the completion of the first loop, the first run of that loop. The total is 3 for the second run, the total is 6 for the third run, the total is 10 for the fourth run, and then the total is 15 for that fifth and final run. So alternatively, what we could go ahead and do is let the user pick their own value. So we brought in the scanner class, we have the import already. So let's go ahead and actually make the object as well. So we'll say scanner keyboard is equal to a new scanner. Go ahead and say system.in, and we'll save that. And then right here, so I need to go ahead and rearrange these now, since instead of what I'm going to go ahead and do is use that print statement to make a request to the user. So I'm going to change this to just print, since the user pushing enter basically captures the new line character anyway. So right here we'll go ahead and say please enter a number of a colon and space. We will no longer need our string concatenation, so I'm going to go ahead and remove all that. We'll just keep our request to the user. And then right here, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of, I'll keep this for a moment, I'm going to modify it in a second. So we're going to go ahead and modify our I, so instead it's going to be the next int that the user gives us. Also go ahead and change this so we can still kind of keep track of precisely what our combined assignment operator is doing. So in this particular case, we're going to ask the user to enter a number. We will then take that number that they give us, we'll add that to total using a combined assignment operator. So basically the same as what I've included in the comment right here. And then at the very end, when we're done with all this, we can go ahead and just print that out to the console. So if I go ahead and run this now, so say please enter a number. So if I give it something like, say, 5, and then 12, and then 3, 7, and let's say 1. So then the total is going to be 28. So if we take a moment to go through this, we have 5 plus 12, that gives us 17, plus 3 would give you 20, plus 7 gives you 27, and then plus 1 is going to be 28. So we can see that with this total that we have right here is going to be the sum of those 5 different user inputs. So this is pretty useful if we know how many things that the user is going to be providing to us. In this case, we're assuming that they want to give us 5 items, but in a lot of cases where you're dealing with something like this running total, you don't necessarily know precisely how many items the user is going to give you. In some cases, maybe you could look at some list that they've given you and just count the number of items and then use that. So maybe you'd have some kind of variable here to hold that, similar to what we saw with our previous versions of the for loop, where we would just ask the user for some variable or for some variable amount that we could put here. But in a lot of cases, if the user doesn't already know exactly how many items they want to use before they've started it, they would need some way to start adding items and then at some point in the program be able to say, okay, I'm done adding items to this running total. I want to go ahead and terminate the program here. I want to go ahead and stop here. So let's take a look at how we might go about doing that. So in some cases, the total number of items to accumulate is unknown. In this case, a Sentinel value could be used to indicate when the user has finished providing numbers to add together, or maybe process in some other way. So a Sentinel value is going to be a special value used to signal that there are no more items to be entered into a list. So essentially, you're going to continuously provide items, and then there's going to be some additional message in that request that will say something to the effect of enter some amount to stop or to end the loop or to terminate. So when the Sentinel value is provided by the user, the loop should terminate. So in order to perform the first check properly, again, we're still going to need a priming read for that first user input. And because of the fact that we're going to be dealing with priming reads and we don't necessarily know how many items the user wants to enter, we are not going to be able to do this with a for loop anymore. So instead, we're going to be using a while loop to accomplish this. So in this particular example, we've got 2 int variables. One is going to be for our running total, so we already have that. But we're also going to have an int variable for whatever the next number is that the user wants to use. And the reason that we're going to do that is because sometimes we need to check the next number that the user is entering to determine whether or not that number, whatever its value happens to be, is meant to be used as our Sentinel value. So in this particular example, we've got our first print statement and our capture of the user's input. So again, we see our priming read before we get into the while loop. So in this case, we've got our print statement, please enter a number. We then have next number is equal to the next int that the user enters. So we'll go ahead and get that with the next int method. And then we come over to our while loop, and we're going to say that while our next number is not equal to -1, so as long as the user didn't give us -1, we're going to add numbers to our total. And the reason that we're doing it this way is because, as I've indicated with this comment here, -1 is going to be our Sentinel value. So once the user enters -1, that's going to be used to indicate that we are done entering numbers into this program. So in this case, once we add that number, whatever next number is to total, assuming that it's not -1, we'll go ahead and include another print statement from the user, again saying please enter a number, and then we'll go ahead and get that number from the user, and that's going to be at the very end of the while loop, because of the fact that the order we're going to do this in is the user will give us a number, we will store that into the next number variable, and then immediately, because we go back to the top of our while loop, we can immediately go ahead and check to see what that number's value is. So we can see if it's actually equal to -1. So because of the fact that we do it in this order, it's pretty convenient for us because it allows us to immediately check if we've given it the Sentinel value. That way then we don't accidentally add that to our total. So we'll go ahead and minimize this. We'll come over here. So at this point, we've got one version of this with a for loop. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is just comment out this portion of the program. So just comment all of that out. And now we're going to go ahead and just kind of repeat this, but with a while loop and a Sentinel value. So first thing I need is going to be an additional variable here for our next number. So I'm going to say int next number. That can initially be 0. So again, this is just going to be a dummy value. Eventually the user is going to overwrite this with whatever input they provide to us. So first we're going to have our priming read. So we'll go ahead and do system.out.print. And for this one, I'll go ahead and say, please enter a number. And then, as I mentioned before, we could also go ahead and include an additional little note to the user to let them know what the Sentinel value would be. So we can go ahead and say, please enter a number, or we can say -1 to stop. And then have our space right there. And then underneath this, we'll go ahead and just take our next number and we'll assign to it the next int that the user gives us. So we'll say keyboard.nextInt. Then we'll go ahead and come over to our while loop. So we're going to say while the next number is not equal to -1, not equal to -1. Then we can go ahead and take the number that they gave us and we can add that to our total. So we go ahead and take our total plus equal next number. Then underneath this, we'll go ahead and just create the next request for the user's number. So say system.out.print. I'm going to say, please enter a number. And again, we'll say -1 to stop. And then underneath that, we'll have that same assignment. So we're going to say next number is going to be equal to keyboard.nextInt. And then at the very end of this, we can go ahead and just print out whatever the total is. So we basically have a statement kind of like what we had right here. So I can just go ahead and grab this statement. We'll go ahead and copy that and paste that right there. Okay. So we'll go ahead and run this program, and while it's running, I'll kind of explain the sequence of steps that we're going through. So we'll go ahead and start running it. So at this point, we've gone through the first couple of statements. So we've gone ahead and initialized each one of these different variables. So we've got our scanner, our two int variables for our total and next number. We've got our first print statement, please enter a number, -1 to stop. And then we're right here on line 22. Because we have that call to next int, it's going to go ahead and wait for the user's input, and we're going to go ahead and store that into next number. So let's go ahead and put in a value right here. Ideally, we'll go ahead and start with a value that is not -1, so we can at least see the rest of the flow of this program. So let's put something like 5 right now. Push enter. So at this point, it came over to the start of my while loop. It checked my condition, and it saw that 5 is not equal to -1, so that made this true. So we can now come into the body of this while loop. We're going to go ahead and take that 5 and add that to total. So again, this is pretty similar to what we have up here. So make another little comment, say this is the same as doing total is equal to total plus next number. So specifically be total plus 5 because of the input that I just gave it. So then once we go ahead and do that, then we're going to come to this print statement right here. And so that's why we see a second instance of please enter a number, -1 to stop. So we're now at line 27. And then coming over to line 28, this is what's making it pause. Again, it's going to be waiting for a user's input. So let's say we go ahead and give it a value like 10 this time. Go ahead and push enter. So now what happens is it takes that 10 that I just gave it, stores that into next number. It then, because it reached the end of the body of this while loop, it will come back up to the top. So we'll come back over here and check this condition. We're going to see 10 not equal to -1. That is again going to be true. So we're going to continue into the body of this while loop. So now we're going to see total plus equals next number. So it's going to take the 5 that it's already added to total. It will then add another 10 to it. So we're going to do 5 plus 10, which gives us 15. Then right here, it's going to go ahead and print out this statement again. So once again, we see please enter a number, -1 to stop. And now, because of line 28, this call to next int, it's currently waiting for me to enter a value. So this time, I'll go ahead and put -1 for it. And now what's going to happen is it's going to take that -1, assign that to next number. Again, we're at the bottom of the while loop, so we're going to wrap back to the top. Right here, we're going to see our condition. So in this case, we say -1 not equal to -1. That's going to be false. It is in fact equal to itself. So we're not going to execute any of the statements inside of the while loop. Instead, we're going to go ahead and move to the next part of the program. So we come down to line 31 right here. And we're going to go ahead and print out this statement. The total is plus whatever our total happens to be. So in this case, the total is going to be 15 because it added the 5 and the 10. And because of the fact that I was careful about the exact order that these statements execute in, I made sure that the Sentinel value, this -1, was not accidentally added to my total. So if you're trying to do something kind of like this and you run into situations where after adding your numbers together, you're finding that your total is, say maybe you're using a Sentinel value of -1, if your total is 1 less than what you were expecting it to be, odds are pretty good it's because of the fact that you have them in such an order that it is accidentally adding this Sentinel value to your total. So you want to be very careful about that. Alright, so at this point, this is going to wrap up everything for these two different ways that we could get a total, whether we know how many items are being added together, or if we're going to let the user just keep going until they're satisfied with how many items they've put in. In the next video, we're going to talk a little bit more about the for loop by discussing a little bit about nested for loops. So we're going to see the logic behind adding for loops inside of other for loops.